The day this video releases is September 7th, 2024, and exactly 20 years ago on September 7th, 2004, Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen released in North America. I still remember waiting in line in GameStop to get this exact copy of Pokemon LeafGreen on release day and playing it non-stop, much like how I played Pokemon Red and Blue non-stop when I was a little kid and first got into Pokemon. Seeing that these games are now 20 years old makes me feel like a Kabuto, but these games have always been very special to me. If you couldn't tell by some of my more recent videos, Generation 3 holds a special place in my heart. So I may be a little bit more biased towards Generation 3 as a whole. So in honor of Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen's 20th anniversary, I want to talk more about them, what they meant for Pokemon as a whole, the good things and the bad things, and how they are 20 years later. FireRed and LeafGreen were released only 8 years after the original Red and Blue games in North America, and while they are remakes of Red and Blue, we have to put an asterisk on that. If you ask Tsunekazu Ishihara, the CEO of the Pokemon Company, he doesn't view these games as remakes at all. At E3 2004, with an interview from IGN, he said, "We don't feel like this is a remake at all. We feel that this is a new game with wireless technology." The reason why they are red and green is that they are the most popular games in the Pokemon series, and we wanted to introduce the concept again for the Gameboy Advance. And it's been 8 years since Red and Blue, so our target audience has changed in that time, and the new audience will see Pikachu or Charizard as new characters. While this might just seem like a PR move to promote the new games being essentially just the same thing as the originals, it does make a lot of sense. First, the third generation games were unable to communicate with the previous 2 generations on the original Game Boy, forcing Pokemon to start from scratch with Generation 3. A lot of this was due to the mechanics overhaul in Generation 3, which made the Generation 3 games age much better than the first 2 generations, but more on that later. It's really not unrealistic to think that after 8 years there would be new fans to Pokemon with Ruby and Sapphire wanting to try the originals. I guess they could have technically just got the original Red, Blue, or Yellow games and played it on their Game Boy Advance, which is also backwards compatible with the Game Boy games anyway. But compared to Ruby and Sapphire, playing Red and Blue, or even Gold and Silver for that matter, feel a bit slower and more clunkier overall. Generation 2 doesn't have this issue as much since they're more polished overall, but the Generation 1 Pokemon games had so many bugs, glitches, or straight up mistakes that caused many issues in the game. Plus, the graphical improvements from Red and Blue to FireRed and LeafGreen are astronomical since some Pokemon in Red and Blue looked like this. What even are these? I currently replayed FireRed and LeafGreen for this video, took my time, and explored the Sevii Islands, which is a part of the game I often ignore when I'm doing a Nuzlocke on these games or something. It was refreshing to play a game on an actual cartridge for FireRed. I mean, I always play on official hardware. But FireRed was the one Pokemon game I never had in English, and I recently picked up this European copy. I mean, as far as I know, there's really no difference between this copy and a regular North American copy, other than the sticker looks a bit different. I did, however, have this weird bootleg version of FireRed that my dad somehow found months before they released FireRed and LeafGreen in North America, but this video isn't about fake games, so with the introduction out of the way, let's dive deeper into Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen and talk about the good and the bad. I'm gonna be a bit of a negative Noctowl in this one, talk about the negatives first. And that's the first negative, Noctowl. Did you know that you cannot catch Noctowl in Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen at all? Noctowl, or Hoothoot specifically, is one of my more low-key favorite Pokemon, and despite it being a pretty iconic Pokemon in the Generation 2 era, seeing it completely absent from the Generation 3 cycle of games until the post-Game of Emerald version is a travesty. This isn't just about Hoothoot though, as this goes for every non-Generation 1 Pokemon. Maybe I'm just spoiled by Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, as I'm currently replaying them too. I'm still trying to get a Shiny Torchic as my starter in Alpha Sapphire though. Let's see if I get it on video. That'd be so sick. Shiny Torchic? No Shiny Torchic. But one thing that I love about Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is how they not only remade Ruby and Sapphire, but they reinvented Hoenn and changed up the story to fit with Pokemon X and Y and the Generation 6 cycle as a whole. While FireRed and LeafGreen were also updated to the Generation 3 mechanics to fit with things like abilities, they still just don't quite feel as connected to Ruby and Sapphire, unlike how the Generation 6 games, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, feel connected to Pokemon X and Y, with how the changes in Omega Ruby tied them in together. And when it comes to Pokemon, I'm really not just talking about Hoothoot, I mean for all non-Generation 1 Pokemon, specifically the Generation 2 Pokemon. I can understand why there are little to no Generation 3 Pokemon in FireRed and LeafGreen because of Ruby and Sapphire existing so closely to them, but seeing how it was established that Johto is right next to Kanto, hence why Johto has a lot of Kanto Pokemon in it, it's not unrealistic to assume that some Johto Pokemon will also make their way into Kanto. For example, Houndoom, a Pokemon introduced with Pokemon Gold and Silver in Generation 2 and is a Generation 2 Pokemon, is only catchable on Route 7 at night in Gold and Silver, and Route 7 is in Kanto. Also, when you go back to the Kanto region in Gold and Silver, the gym leaders there will have some Generation 2 Pokemon, like Erica and her Jumpluff, or Blade and his Macargo. They did at least give you access to one of the legendary Gen 2 beasts depending on which starter you picked, which was nice to make them more accessible at least, but again, if these Pokemon come over to Kanto, why can't we have some Hoothoots as well? Many of the Generation 2 Pokemon were so hard to get in Generation 3, especially if you didn't have a GameCube and this silly wire. I know Gold and Silver were just in the previous generation, and while this was the third time in a row you can fight these gyms in a mainline Pokemon game, if the reasoning behind FireRed and LeafGreen being new experience is because new players coming in with the new Advance era wouldn't have seen these Generation 1 Pokemon, why not also add some Generation 2 Pokemon that they also wouldn't have seen? I mean, sure, there's some Generation 2 Pokemon in the post-game if you go all the way through the Sevii Islands, more on that later. But for returning players, adding these Generation 2 Pokemon in the main line of the game would add to the experience for the returning players, as it won't feel like the exact same thing as Pokemon Red and Blue, being limited to the same Pokemon as you were in those games. Whenever we revisit Kanto, which is pretty often, they seem to want to try and keep the experience as intact and possible to what it was in Generation 1, but then they still add other changes anyway. Sure, it might not make too much sense in the continuity of the Pokemon timeline if Johto Pokemon were all of a sudden in Kanto, and these same events with Team Rocket and Red transpired in Kanto anyway, but Pokemon lore never makes sense. I mean, just look at the other Kanto remakes, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which followed these same exact events as Red and Blue as well, but inexplainably just have different protagonists, but still have Red and Blue in the games, which just makes no sense to me. What makes things even worse is there are some Generation 1 Pokemon that received evolutions later on that you just can't get in FireRed and LeafGreen. Let's say you catch a Zubat and add it to your team. It's a very common Pokemon that you'll encounter a lot throughout your playthrough and evolves into Golbat, which is pretty decent too, so it's not unrealistic to think that many people have a Golbat on their teams in this game. Eventually, that Golbat will gain happiness the more you use it, which is needed for it to evolve into Crobat, the new Generation 2 evolution to it, but no, the game will just tease you and stop Golbat from evolving into Crobat until you get the National Dex. The same goes for Espeon and Umbreon too. This might not seem like much of an issue, as once you get the National Dex, you could just evolve your Eevee into Espeon in the morning if you want anyway, much like how you can evolve your Golbat into Crobat now. Right? Well, no, you can't, because FireRed and LeafGreen don't have a day-night cycle or any time-based events, meaning the game will never know if it's morning or night for your Eevee to evolve into Espeon or Umbreon. Day and night was a big deal in Generation 2, and while it wasn't as big of a focus in Ruby and Sapphire, they at least had some sort of day-night cycle as well as some time-based events that allow you to get Espeon and Umbreon, but in FireRed and LeafGreen, you just can't ever evolve Eevee into either of its Generation 2 evolutions, and have to rely on getting Espeon or Umbreon in this game by trading an Eevee from Ruby and Sapphire and evolving it there, or getting one from Colosseum or XD Gale of Darkness. This is what I mean when I say that although FireRed and LeafGreen are in the Generation 3 cycle of games, they feel a bit more detached compared to Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. This would be like if in Generation 4, if you wanted to get some of the new evolutions introduced in that generation, instead of getting them in, say, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, you had to go back to Diamond, Pearl, or Platinum to evolve these Pokemon, which just sounds silly because it is, but then again, they literally did that with FireRed and LeafGreen to Ruby and Sapphire. I understand that FireRed and LeafGreen were their first time remaking game, and I might be a bit harsh for this video, but I feel like if something like this happened today, it would be a sword and shield situation all over again, and I really don't want to relive that era of the internet again. So initially when I was planning this video, I wanted to talk about the good and the bad in separate sections, but a lot of things can be good and bad when it comes to FireRed and LeafGreen, so we're just gonna jump between the two depending on what we're talking about. First, shiny hunting. Yes, I'm one of those weird freaks who constantly encounter the same Pokemon over and over again in older Pokemon games for a 1 in 8,192 chance of them being a different color, or 1 in 4,096 post Generation 5. Shinies didn't exist in Generation 1, technically, and one cool way to shiny hunt was in the Game Corner in Generation 2, where you just kept resetting Pokemon you could win in the Game Corner, but Ruby and Sapphire didn't have any prize Pokemon in the Game Corner. FireRed and LeafGreen do though, much like how they did in Red and Blue, so now we can finally shiny hunt in the Game Corner again and get a shiny Porygon. Assuming we gamble and get lucky enough for 999 coins, which is how much it costs to get Porygon, and just look away European Union, there's nothing to see here. Another positive for FireRed and LeafGreen is the updated mechanics. Sort of. There's some negatives here too, but seeing all of these old Pokemon get abilities now, be able to hold items and have natures changes how you play the game. Now, instead of just catching the first Growlithe you see on Route 8, you might want to try again for an Intimidate one instead of Flash Fire, as Flash Fire is a bit more common, and Intimidate is just far more useful. The introduction of the new types changed a lot too, well, more specifically the Dark type, as introducing Steel didn't really change much to be honest. But now we have a move like Bite, which was a common move in Generation 1 and also a normal type move back then, which is Dark type to help with those pesky Psychic types, as everybody knows how overpowered Psychic Pokemon were in the Generation 1 games. Having Bite was great, as I can now use Bite on my Arcanine against Sabrina to get through her much easier than I would have in a Gen 1 game. These might seem like pretty minor things, but this does affect every single Pokemon in the game, and affects pretty much every battle you do, so it adds up. Now, for example, in Koga's gym, instead of spamming a ground-type move like you might have done for Lieutenant Surge a few gyms prior, you can't do that because his Weezing has Levitate and is immune to ground types, so you have to think outside the box a little bit. Assuming you get through his really annoying Minimize Muck, which just shouldn't exist in a Pokemon game. Another big focus with Ruby and Sapphire were double battles, and they did at least change some of the random enemy trainers to incorporate a few double battles, which was a nice change of pace. I feel like Ruby and Sapphire also didn't really do a great job of having double battles, as there's very few double battles in that game, but at least Emerald kind of redeemed that, adding way more double battles. They also changed some Pokemon learn sets. This was not only to incorporate new moves, as many of the Generation 1 moves were just pretty terrible, but it also made the games a bit easier. Charmander gets Metal Claw early on now to help with Brock if you fix it, which is probably the only time a Steel-type move is useful in this game, by the way. And Fighting-type Pokemon actually have Fighting-type moves they can use now, instead of only having to rely on Submission, which is one of the worst moves ever. Another one of my low-key favorite Pokemon is Poliwag, so when I replayed Fire Red for this video, I went out of my way to catch one and evolve it into Poliwrath. I never cared too much for using fighting types in Gen 1 because of how bad they are, but in Generation 3 we have usable fighting type moves like Brick Break, making Pokemon like Poliwrath much easier to use. I did run into one issue when I caught that Poliwag, as well as the Seaking I also caught, because I just think Seaking is cool, and that was the level gaps in this game. Level gaps are a common complaint in Pokemon games, especially when it comes to the Johto-based games, but I have to talk about it a little bit here as well. Now, maybe I am spoiled, since the last few years when I played through a Pokemon game, I would do a Nuzlocke and just stumble upon heaps of rare candies randomly, mainly so I didn't have to waste time grinding, but there's points of this game where it's pretty easy to be underleveled, and if you're on an actual cartridge, it's much harder to accidentally stumble upon rare candies. Maybe I amplified the issue by catching a low-level Poliwag so late in the game and training it up, but I battled nearly every trainer I could while playing through this game and really took my time during this playthrough, but still found myself being pretty underleveled, especially post-Erica. It was worse between Blaine and the Champion, but I had two water-type Pokemon, so Blaine and Giovanni were pretty easy for me. Being underleveled could be by design to make the games a bit harder, since you could just focus on type advantages while spamming potions to get through most fights, which is exactly what I did, but I did also spend quite a bit of time grinding with help from the Versus Seeker though, to get my team to close level 50 for the Elite Four. I also just want to point out the funny animations the trainers make when you use the Versus Seeker to rebattle them again. The bikers on Cycling Road even look like they're flipping you off. Now, the main reason why I was grinding is because the Champion has a level 63 Pokemon has his Ace, and I wanted to be around level 55 or so, but that was just taking too long, so I just went in with Pokemon between level 45 and 50, and got through it on my first time without really much of an issue, thanks to knowing type advantages, shout out to you Hop, and using revives. Again, maybe doing Nuzlocks for so long and hyper-focusing on level caps with rare candies has skewed my view on leveling, especially when it comes to FireRed and LeafGreen, but I was genuinely concerned that I would lose the Elite Four if my Pokemon were 15 plus levels below the Champion's Ace. When you look at it from a game design perspective though, it does make sense to have points where bosses just have higher level monsters than you do to make it harder, and playing this game casually again and being 10 plus levels below some trainers sometimes made me realize that being underleveled really isn't as big of a deal as people make it out to be, especially if you know how type advantages work. I also saw some weird things since I was taking my time, like an NPC in Lavender Town who gives you the return TM because her Pokemon died, so she won't need it anymore. How dark is that? Now, since I took my time and took about 23 hours to fully do everything I wanted to do in this game, I explored the Sevii Islands quite a bit, a brand new area to Kanto in FireRed and LeafGreen, which was a mixed bag and just never returned again. First, new content is always nice in a Pokemon game, especially when it comes to post-game content. While it wasn't as expansive as Generation 2, cramming a whole other region in its post-game, it's still cool and has a battle tower on Sevii Island, which Generation 1 didn't originally have. I was never too huge into the battle tower, but I know there's a huge subset of players who love things like the battle tower, so it's nice to have it in FireRed and LeafGreen as well. This does add countless hours of replayability if you're willing to grind up a good team for it, which I plan on doing eventually. The Sevii Islands as a whole are pretty weird though, and could warrant their own video entirely, but I'll just talk about them here. The Sevii Islands are unlocked pretty late in the game, right after you exit Blaine's gym after collecting your 7th gym badge. Bill stops you and asks if you want to go there, but you could say no and return later, which is what I usually do when I play through these games. You can find him in the Pokemon Center on Cinnabar Island waiting for you to go back at any point later, if you really want to visit the first 3 islands before becoming the champion. There aren't really any new Pokemon on the first 3 islands yet, but there is a small side mission involving a lost girl you need to rescue in the Berry Forest. Now, a little bit of a side tangent here, getting off the Sevii Islands for a bit, but you guys know I love berries. And you can even find a lot of berries on the ground in the Berry Forest. Pretty cool, right? I mean, berries were a big part of Generation 3. They grow on trees and they're needed for contests as well, but neither of those are in FireRed and LeafGreen either. This is a casualty of not having a clock system, so you can't grow berries, but after a certain amount of steps, some berries can respawn on the ground in the Berry Forest, and you can also use the pickup ability on Pokemon like Meowth to pick up other berries that you can't easily find in this game, which is something that I did for the first half that I was playing through this game. Although since Meowth loses the pickup ability upon evolution and no other Pokemon in this game get pickup, I stopped using Meowth pretty early on. It's better than nothing, I guess, but it still would have been nice if we could have had berry trees across the Kanto region too, as this is another thing that separates FireRed and LeafGreen too much from Ruby and Sapphire. Anyway, back to the Sevii Islands. Once completing the first 3 islands and finding the secret to time travel or whatever, you can become the champion with your underleveled team and then do the rest of the islands. Here is a funny side note though. In the Prima strategy guide for FireRed and LeafGreen, the one we looked at in the first intended video, they only talk about the first 3 islands in the Sevii Islands. That's because they don't really tell you about the other 4 islands unless you have at least 60 Pokemon caught in your Pokedex and then you talk to Professor Oak in Pallet Town. Now at this point, I was catching a lot of Pokemon, way more than I normally do in most playthroughs, as in most playthroughs my box is maybe 2 or 3 Pokemon, if that. But this time I had about 55 Pokemon caught after becoming the champion and couldn't access the rest of the islands until I had a total of 60. Maybe that's why the Prima guide didn't have the other islands listed, because you have no way of knowing how to access them unless you started catching Pokemon. I guess the game just assumed you'd try to catch them all after becoming the champion, and eventually figure that out on your own. But since Ruby and Sapphire dropped the gotta catch 'em all tagline from the boxes, and because of how hard it actually is to catch all Generation 3 Pokemon, as we discussed in a recent video, a lot of people probably would stop playing here. Not me though, as I had the power of Twitch chat watching me play live. Follow me on Twitch, by the way, link in the description, and while you're at it, why not leave a like and subscribe as well, who told me that I needed 60 Pokemon to access the rest of the islands. So after catching a few more Pokemon, we get the Rainbow Pass, which is not related to Ho-Oh despite having Rainbow in its name, giving us access to the rest of the islands. The other islands focus on Team Rocket scrambling after their leader, Giovanni, disappears. This touches on what happened between Team Rocket from the events of Red and Blue and the events of Gold and Silver, which was nice for lore building, and the other islands finally let you get more Generation 2 Pokemon, but there's also Braille. Yes, out of all of the weird mechanics that Generation 3 had with Ruby and Sapphire, one of them they decided to bring over was Braille, and not berries. Now, any normal child would be unable to do this much, like the Braille puzzles in Ruby and Sapphire for the Reggies, but at least in Ruby and Sapphire, you have to go a bit out of your way to even get the Reggies and read the Braille, and it's more like a secret and not just part of the main game. In FireRed LeafGreen though, it's tied to the post-game story, which is much less avoidable and kind of part of the main game, sort of, and is much less avoidable than finding some secret legendary Pokemon. Reading Braille from a flat screen also just is weird to me because that's not how Braille's supposed to work, because, you know, you're supposed to read it by touching it. And since I was a weird kid who had to learn how to read Braille in elementary school, I still don't know why they made me do that. I was able to figure this out when I was like 9 years old. I don't remember how to read it anymore, but as a child I did, and that's how I first beat the Sevii Islands in Leaf Green. Like, how would anybody else know that if you use the cut HM in front of this door, it will open on the Sevii Islands? Braille wasn't really a focus in these games in the main story, and while you do have to go past some Braille writings to get the Ruby and Sapphire items for Celio to do his machine thing, it's also pretty easy to miss. On top of that, they expect you to what? Write down what the Braille writings are on this door, go back to the dictionary room or whatever it is, where you find the Ruby, cross-reference each letter on the door to each of these individual tablets, and then see that the writing spells out spells out C-U-T for cut, so that way you can go into your party, manually use cut, open the door, and go in. And then once you go in, you have an option to go to 4 different directions with Braille writing in the middle telling you where to go, but since it's in Braille, you still have to go back to the dictionary room and figure out which each of these directions are saying. It was weird, convoluted, and strangely did not correlate to the Regis or anything at all. I don't know what it was with Braille in Generation 3, but after doing all of this, you can fight Team Rocket and explore the rest of the Sevii Islands, which is pretty neat. While it was weird and the execution was even weirder, I like the Sevii Islands as a concept. There's another daycare on the Sevii Islands that we can finally breed Pokemon in too, as the daycare near Cerulean City only lets you have 1 Pokemon in it, and overall, if you're somebody who wants to focus on the Battle Tower and making a competitive team, you'd be spending a lot of time on these islands. Now, for the bonus round. Let's talk about weird stuff relating to Pokemon FireRed and Leaf Green. First, there's this thing. It came bundled with the game and acts as a wireless link cable, assuming at least 2 people had one. If you remember back in the Ishihara quote, this is what he was talking about when he was talking about wireless technology. It was kind of bulky though, and annoying to keep on your Gameboy Advance or your SP, so no one really used it, and I often opted to just use the old original link cables. While I do remember some in-person events that require you to use this wireless adapter to get the gift Pokemon, it was still pretty silly, especially since it didn't even allow a Game Boy Advance to connect with somebody playing a GBA Pokemon on the Nintendo DS, which would have been better since the DS released the same year as FireRed, and since the DS is backwards compatible, people might have just traded in their Game Boy Advance for it, but if you do that, then now you just can't trade between Pokemon games. That's more Nintendo's fault if anything, I guess though. FireRed and Leaf Green expanded on some key items too with the TM and the berry case to compact the bag a bit more, and it also had unlimited storage unlike Ruby and Sapphire, which was a big plus, especially compared to the Gen 1 games where you could have a total of like 10 different items at a time. I was going to go more in depth with other things like localization differences between the Japanese, European, and American versions and how they released a version 1.1, which pretty much only fixes Chikorita Sprite apparently, which is a Pokemon you'd rarely ever see in FireRed and Leaf Green anyway, so it's pretty fun that they even bothered to change it, but maybe in a future video we can discuss this as I've been yapping for far too long. I'm not sure how you guys are going to like this new genre of videos, which I can just boil down to just me yapping about playing Pokemon, as I'm pretty much done with doing mainly challenge content and Nuzlocke. As when I look at my analytics, the videos that people like to watch the most are videos like this anyway, and I haven't really been making too many of those the last year or so why not just go back to it? I don't really know what to call this genre of video as they're kind of all over the place, but yapping about Pokemon is the best genre I can describe it as. So yeah, that's Pokemon FireRed and Leaf Green 20 years later. I know I bashed them a lot, but I still think that this is the best way to play through the Kanto region, as the alternative is, well, but then again, used cartridges of FireRed and Leaf Green run more than a brand new Switch game would cost you anyway, so maybe if they would finally just bring the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games to Nintendo Switch Online, more Pokemon fans can go back and experience them. I'm getting real tired of buying the same game multiple times just for videos. These aren't even all my copies of Ruby version. I have more for some reason. The graphical updates from Pokemon Red and Blue and the quality of life adjustments like being able to run, having more bag storage, and having far less bugs in the original games more than make up for all the things I dislike about them. I mean, they're definitely not the worst remake Pokemon games, so I'll give them some points for that. FireRed and Leaf Green also set the precedent of Pokemon games being remade after a certain amount of time. Still waiting on those Gen 5 remakes, by the way. Any day now. But this year also marks the 10th anniversary of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which coincidentally are also remake games that are tied to the 3rd generation, so maybe you can expect a video on those games pretty soon as well. Assuming this Torchic will shine, because I also want to play through it with a Shining Starter and make a video on shine hunting in this game, but no shiny. Alright, that's enough yapping about Pokemon. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a good rest of your day. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe, all that jazz, or just don't. It doesn't really matter, I guess. But again, thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day. I'll see you all next time, and bye-bye.